good evening to all the women present here today. I'm Ruhi Walia Syal, and on behalf of Prabha Ketan Foundation and Ehsas Women, I have been given the onus to introduce a man that actually needs no introduction. Our guest today has just published his 21st book, and we are here to talk about the same and more. He's one of those rare breed of politicians who has a passion for words, who makes scintillating speeches, and we all can't help but swoon over him. He's synonymous with excellent command over English language and astounding vocabulary. After amazing and perplexing us with his tweets, he has come to our rescue with his book, Tharoorasaurus. I'm sure you all will agree when I say that he's India's most charming politician, author, personality, an icon, and so much more. Presenting Dr. Shashi Tharoor to all of you.
Thank you for that gorgeous introduction. Very, very pleased.
You're welcome. Pleased to have you here, sir.
Good to be with you.
Now handing over to Preeti Gill, our Ehsas Women from Amritsar. Preeti is an independent literary agent who has more than 20 years experience in publishing industry as a commissioning editor and rights director. She has set up her own cultural and literary hub in Amritsar. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation.
I'd like you to tell us about your childhood and this long affair that you've had with words. And the dedication, of course, in the book is to your father. So maybe we could hear a little bit about your own childhood and all those trips with your family and your father playing all those word games.
Absolutely. Well, actually, my father has always been the strongest sort of figure in my life. He was everything to me: teacher, guide, research advisor, imparter of values, my source of faith, my source of energy, and even of self-belief. And in many ways, my enthusiasm for life and my appetite for learning are inherited from him, because he was like that himself. And my workaholism also comes from him. And so does my love for words. So Dad was absolutely a word nut. He was a Scrabble addict before it was fashionable. So from the 50s, he would organize groups of friends to play Scrabble. He played every word game that had been invented, including Boggle, acrostics and crosswords in newspapers. But he would play games with my sisters and me when we were kids that involved words. So for example, one very common game that I'm sure many listening in would have played would be, he'd use a 9 or 10 letter word and then challenge my sisters and me to derive new words of 4 letters or more using the letters in that long word. And my sisters were younger, so they would be allowed 3-letter words. I would only be allowed 4-letter words and above. And it challenged us to think about words and, of course, to know more in the process. And he would play along with us. And then, of course, he would always get more words than us, but he would tell us and teach us in the process. Another word game that he invented for family car journeys was one of the passengers had to imagine a 5-letter word, and the others had to guess it within 20 attempts by trying out different 5-letter words and being told only how many letters match. So if he imagined the word, if he imagined gills, for example, to derive from yours, and we just guessed at random, say stick. Well, gills contains an I and an S, which is also in stick, so he'd say 2. Then we would systematically, it also taught us to do logical thinking. We would think of another word in which, say, 2 of the letters were not in common, and by elimination, we'd have to guess which letters were there. And eventually, I must say, we end up with, if you're smart enough, with the right word that he's guessed, simply by guessing the letters through a process of reason.
It sounds
so all of this fascination.
Complicated.
No, I'm making it sound more complicated than it is. If we had planned this better, we would have agreed that we'll actually play one round and make it work. But
my God, I think then I'd have probably got thrown out of that window that you also talked about, because there was this long word which said you get chucked out of a window.
That's what would have defenestrate. Defenestrate is one of the first words in the book. It's one of my favorites, actually. It goes back to college days when as a college debater, I would love to use words for rejecting people's ideas and arguments. And defenestrate was a perfect word because it literally means throwing out of the window. But in these civilized days, you don't really throw anything out of the window anymore, or anyone out of the window anymore. Whereas when the word became used, it actually involved physically throwing people out of the window. I recount in the book about an incident in the Czech parliament, and when they threw a couple of people out, and they only managed to save their lives because they landed in a huge mound of garbage. But I thought that the whole idea of defenestrate as a metaphorical word, that instead of trying to throw out a politician or a government, which we are trying to do in the opposition, we can say we want to defenestrate them. Or to reject a bad idea, we defenestrate the idea. I rather like that.
It's completely lovely. And I did not know, and I'm sure very few people ever did, that there was a British apostrophe protection society. How fabulous that sounds. I mean, as an worthwhile editor, it's something that I just completely love. I don't think I could have done without the apostrophe myself.
But unfortunately, they shut down. They shut down. They shut down because
that's what you said. Yes.
Oh, they said that the ignorance and laziness present in modern times have won, because the battle for the proper usage of the apostrophe was what that society was trying to wage, and they discovered that they simply couldn't maintain it. But it can be very confusing not to use an apostrophe, so it's a battle that was worth waging.
I do think so, yes. I think I mean, one must not lose the apostrophe at all. Many other words that you have in there are completely new, and I don't know of anybody who uses them other than you. But also there are many words that are pretty common usage. So why did you put them in?
So my logic was, let's have different kinds of words in the book and not just things that only kids wanting to pass quiz contests will learn. So I used either some words, fairly unusual ones that I had recently used in a tweet, like farrago, which got me a lot of notoriety, or snollygost, or even kakistocracy, which I used to describe it. Kakistocracy is a government made up of the least qualified and most unprincipled people in society. And so it was a good word for an opposition MP to use. So I had included words like that. Then I used words that the country was already using a lot more, like pandemic and quarantine, but to tell the stories about these words, what they meant and the concepts behind them. And then sometimes words in the news, like, for example, impeachment when Donald Trump was impeached, or apostrophe when the society closed down. Or sometimes, frankly, just words that I could tell interesting stories about, like defenestrate or curfew. And I'm sure that some of you who are not particularly political or who love our present government will say, oh, we should have expected this, when they see words like lynch and vigilante, which obviously gave me a chance to take a swipe at some of the misbehavior of supporters of the government.
There's actually quite a lot of that, and which is, I think, why I enjoyed the book so much, because I would not normally have enjoyed a book like this, to just look at words and see what they mean and where they come from. But the fact that every word actually also carries an opinion, it shows, of course, your political leanings, but there's also a lot of, I think, hard facts that one finds in there. And that is what actually makes it really fascinating and interesting for maybe another kind of reader.
So Preeti, I've always believed that in anything I write, that the research must be solid. I mean, it's not a scholarly book, and I'm not writing it for scholars and academics. And the illustrations, which give it a very light and almost jocular feel, you know, this dinosaur with my face and so on, I think will confirm that. But for example, when you speak about expressing opinions, I do express some political opinions. I would say probably about 10% of the words. I do express political opinions. And I thought to write without reference to the terrible injustices and wrongs we're seeing around us would also be an act of abdication to want to do it. So at the same time, I have opinions that have nothing to do with politics. Like, for example, the word goon is an example of both, because in my thing about goon, I talk about the goons who assaulted students at JNU could not have entered and left without the complicity of the police. So there's goon right there. Yeah. But at the same time, I get into a quarrel with the lexicographers and the lexicologists who insist that goon comes from some obscure American comic strip featuring Alice the Goon. I'm convinced that the popularity of goon is because of British prisoners of war at the hands of the Germans, who were familiar with the word gunda back in India and referred to their German guards as goons. So there's my opinion. I'm not sure that the Oxford English Dictionary will support me, but as an Indian, I'm willing to stand up for it. Just as, you know, mugger, which I've not written in the book, but I have a view that when you're mugged by a mugger in the Western world, I think it comes from the mugger march, the crocodile. because you can just see the Magarmach closing its teeth around you or your wallet.
Yeah. And what about, I mean, you've also a word which is, simple enough, hyperbole, where you say it's the PM's promise to put 15 lakhs in every Indian's account. I mean, that's
I think
quite an example.
I'm being very, very kind to him, Preeti, because his own party president called it a jumla. By saying hyperbole, I'm making it sound more respectable.
Yeah, but that's quite something. Then I've also got another word down, Panglossian, where you've given the example of Ayushman Bharat.
You see, Panglossian is a word which actually has multiple usages, but always refers to excessive degrees of optimism. And it comes from a character in Voltaire's Candide who said, always, he said, all is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. So any bad news, he would say, no, this is for the best. And we all know people like that, they're Panglossians. And it helps them live in this world, it helps them cope with disaster because they see even disaster was foreordained and was a good thing for them, etc. Now, in those circumstances, that excessive optimism, you can understand. When a government comes up with completely far-fetched claims, I think it's fair to call them Panglossian because Ayushman Bharat, frankly, has not at all proved its utility in terms of helping the people whom they claim they're designing it for, and they've helped. So my whole argument is that when you're looking at something like a government scheme, you really can't afford to be Panglossian about it. You have to be somewhat, shall we say, realistic. And in this particular instance, I don't believe the government was.
Yeah. So I mean, so these were the little nuggets that I completely enjoyed reading about. And then there's xenophobia, where you bring in NRC. There's yogi, where we know what you will bring in, and
who I will bring in. Yes.
There's snollygoster, where again we have some other unprincipled characters floating in and out. And then right at the end, you have Zugzwang, right?
Zugzwang, yes. Zugzwang is an English word coming from German. It's a German word, and the Germans pronounce the Z with a sort of hidden T behind it, so it becomes Zugzwang. But in fact, it's a very useful word for people writing about politics because Zugzwang is a move in chess where, you can't pass in chess. Like in some card games, you can pass your turn. Even in Scrabble, my dad's game, you could pass. But in chess, you can't pass. So if you have to play your turn and you're forced to make a move that will result in your own capitulation, that's called Zugzwang. Yeah. And the truth is that in politics, that often happens. And I gave a couple of political examples when governments and states were forced to fall because they had no choice under the rules of the game. They had to make a move, and that move exposed their own hollowness or weakness, and they had to resign. The same that happened to the Fadnavis Pawar government in Maharashtra last year, and it happened to the Kamal Nath government in late March this year. So you see a situation where the rules of the game oblige you to do something that's not in your interest. What a lovely word, because it's something that happens to us all the time in life.
Which leads me to my question that all of these words and the usage that you've ascribed to them, they actually have allowed you to write a little essay along with it and express an opinion.
Right.
And is that what makes Thesaurus different from a regular thesaurus?
Oh, of course, because a thesaurus, strictly speaking, just a list of words, right? You will give a name and they look it up in the thesaurus, it'll give you 10 synonyms. And if it's a very sophisticated thesaurus, it'll give you 10 antonyms as well. That's a thesaurus. Mine is not like, mine gives you the following. It gives you a definition. It gives you an example of usage at the very beginning of the short essay so that you know how the word reads in a sentence. And then it gives you a short essay, which varies from anything from 300, 400 words for the shortest ones to about 800 for the longest ones. So it's an essay depending on what stories I have to tell, what opinions I have to express, and sometimes more examples are thrown in. So it could sometimes be a fairly consistent thing where, for example, paracosm, this imaginary make-believe word that's created inside your mind, there's only one explanation, one different, and just a few examples. But then if you take something like paraprosdokion, which is a figure of speech in which the latter part of a sentence or phrase is completely surprising or unexpected in a way that prompts you to rethink the first part. Now that the only way I could effectively illustrate is to give example after example. So a favorite paraprosdokian is something like, I want to die peacefully in my sleep like my father, not screaming and terrified like his passengers. So,
Yeah.
you know, you hear the first part of the sentence and you think of the sort of sentiment, and then the second part of the sentence sounds like the chap had fallen asleep and had driven his bus passengers into an accident. So, you know, that kind of off a cliff or something. So that kind of thing is a paraprosdokian, but there are various kinds. Groucho Marx saying, I've had a perfectly wonderful evening, but this wasn't it, to a hostess. I mean, you can imagine how that would come across. Yeah.
So, but when Meru Gokhale asked you to do this book, is this what she intended you to do?
That you'll have to ask her, but she seems very happy with the results. The book has been doing well. It's been on assorted bestseller lists, and it's the kind of book that, you know, is not topical per se. So it should continue to be in people's shopping lists for a while to come. That's the publisher's hope anyway. You know that in writing, the publishers will make the money, not the writer. But I just want to be read. And I think if the publishers are happy, then I can't complain, because then they won't complain either.
And then there's a point in one of them where you say, in one of those little essays where you say that you lack epicaricacy. Is that
epicaricacy, right? Actually, I use that word deliberately because epicaricacy is not a very well-known word in English, even though the German word for the same idea is quite well known to English speakers. Schadenfreude, which is to take pleasure in the misfortunes of others, is very often used by English speakers, certainly in the Western world. Even if they don't know German, that word is often used, at least in writing. People may not know how to pronounce it, but they use it in writing because it's a very well-known concept. And frankly, as a human emotion, taking pleasure in other people's misfortunes, sadly, there's too much of, and we all see it around us, right? So
yeah,
to my mind...
But you also say over there that you were born without an envy gene. So
yes, I'm blessed that way. So epicaricacy is the English word for Schadenfreude. No, in my case, it's simply this, Preeti. From a very young age, I always found nothing to resent in other people's successes. We're a hyper-competitive culture. And maybe it helped that I was very good at taking exams. I kept coming first in class. I never had that complex. But even if I didn't, I don't think it would bother me, because I've always felt that, felt two things. First, that the world is large enough for many of us to succeed without having to pull anyone down. And secondly, that ultimately the only useful measure of success, the only useful yardstick, is against yourself and not against somebody else. In other words, if you have done the best you can do, it shouldn't matter if somebody has done better or somebody has done worse, because they've done the best they can do. Where you can blame yourself is when you don't try hard enough. That's been my philosophy, and I brought up my children to believe that. And I tell everyone, whenever I'm asked to address college groups or high school leavers and so on, that's my message. Ultimately, be the best you that you can be. Ultimately, that's the only thing any of us can do. And therefore, there's no reason for envy, because other people are being who they are. And I've been very non-judgmental all my life. I don't meet people and then turn around and judge them the moment they've left. I think as long as people are not harming others, they should be free to be who they are, try to do what they want to do, achieve what they want to achieve. That's their issue, their life. And I'm very much in favor of letting them go ahead and do that.
Since this is your 21st book, and your 22nd is on the way, coming out in November or so, I believe. And so there's a whole lot of research that goes into each of these, and you're so prolific. How does that happen? How do you find time for it in between all your being a professional career politician, etc., etc.? How do you find time for so much work and so much research?
It's hard, Preeti, and I must say I don't sleep enough. But it's also true that the lockdown helped, in the sense that I've led a very busy lockdown life. But it's been probably the first time in ages that I've not been confined only to the night to do my reading, research, or writing. A lot of the work that I've been able to do is work that, frankly, otherwise in normal circumstances would have involved extensive travel. Here, I'm not getting up early in the morning and hopping into a plane to go to one place, make a speech, hopping into a plane, going off somewhere else, etc. I am sitting in my own home in front of my own screen and reaching multiple audiences. So that has been a time-saving device. And I must say, though Tharoorosaurus was pretty much done before the lockdown and therefore would have been out in a normal world by the 1st of May, I don't think that the battle of belonging could have been finished without the lockdown helping me. I think it would have taken me many, many months more to conclude all the work and to write it to my satisfaction. But during the lockdown, I was able to finish it more rapidly. And as a result, that's why the 22nd book is coming out already this year.
Among the many books, what have you enjoyed working on the most? Which has been the best or the most enjoyable project?
It's very invidious, Preeti, to ask any author to choose in any way from any of his books. It's like asking a mother to name her favorite child.
Yeah, but you have Sophie's choice here, so yeah.
So it's a very difficult choice that Sophie had to make, and she couldn't live with herself after making it. So you know how it goes. I mean, the fact is that each book, if you're sincere, if you have integrity as an author, you put everything of yourself into that book while you're producing it. Once you've done it, it has to make its own way in the world. It has to walk on its own 2 feet. And the fact is that, to be very honest, I have sometimes looked back on a book I wrote many years ago and marveled at what I've written. But there have been times I look back on a book and said, God, that sentence could have been better. Or why didn't I use this word here? And the answer I tell myself is, just as you can't go back and correct the walk of a child or the color of the eyes of a child or whatever, similarly, you can't correct a book once it's published. At least I don't think you should. And therefore, it should be out there in its own right. And so I believe each book has its own integrity, its own standing. I don't think that I would like to choose amongst them in any way. I really believe that so far anyway, I haven't had any reason to disown any of them. And I hope all 22 will appeal to different readers who have different tastes and different inclinations.
So anyway, this is on a lighter note, because I thought I would tell you something about my grandson, who was just about 5 years old when he made up this word. And the word is be hiding. And be hiding was hiding behind his mother.
That's a lovely word. That's a clever word. It's what would be called a cromulent word.
Yes, exactly. And then there is another word which was coined by my 2 daughters when, they thought that the parental eye was getting a bit much. And so this word is encroach. And it comes from encroach and ensconce, where you try to be really, sort of nice and fuzzy and warm, but it's also encroaching on somebody. So it was encroach. I just wanted to say those anyway.
I think that shows a very creative set of genes in your family. Well done, Preeti.
So anyway, this is my last question because I think I'm running out of time now. I really want to know about the new book, because this is what I would definitely want to be reading next.
I hope you will, because it's actually a rather important theme. Nationalism is a concept that's only a couple of 100 years old, and I've tried to explore it, the theory, the concept, the evolution of it, and its application around the world in the first 100 pages of the book. Then I take the idea of nationalism incorporated in the Indian constitution, the idea of India that we hear so much about, Tagore's phrase, but an idea, what does it encapsulate? What's it all about? What's the implicit notion of nationalism embedded in it? Then I talk about the workings of that idea, constitutionally and in practice, and then the attempts to transform that idea into something different under the last 6 years of BJP majority rule. And finally, I come up with my own conclusion, my own plea for a certain notion of nationalism. To not make it sound too theoretical, let me say the essential difference is between what one would call civic nationalism, which is a nationalism of institutions, and ethno-religious nationalism, which is a nationalism of identities. And we very consciously, our nationalist leaders had chosen a civic nationalist form for the Indian constitution, for Indian citizenship, and for what we were expected to be loyal to. And that is being pushed into a much more explicit Hindu majoritarian view of nationhood, which I believe is a fundamental challenge to the core civic nationalism of India. So the book is a fairly serious political argument, aside from being at the same time a conceptually an argument that will also engage, I hope, fairly serious readers of the op-ed pages of newspapers. Again, I don't write scholarly books, though this one is extensively footnoted and so on, because I want the scholars. In fact, when I did my first draft, I sent it to 2 or 3 scholars. I've acknowledged them in the book to get their views. I didn't want to say that, what you're writing is all old hat. We academics already have beaten all these ideas to death. Instead, I got some very positive feedback. And therefore, I believe it is a contribution to some ideas about nationalism, even where perhaps it is really appealing not to the scholar, but to the intelligent newspaper readers who I hope will want to buy and read the book.
Yeah, I do think so also, because, I mean, this whole question of belonging, unbelonging, who sort of at one point belongs and then you step over a line and then you suddenly don't belong. I think all of those things should be something that we all think about and question anyway, every day, I think. So yes, I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm sure a lot of your audience of readers is also looking out for this book. I think I should go to audience questions. I've had a wonderful, wonderful time. I'm sorry about all those internet problems, but...
Thank you, Preeti. I've been there, I understand. No problem.
So can I ask Manisha to please help with the questions, since I'm on the phone now and I can't really see too much of chat.
Yeah, so we have Ridhima ji, so I'll just put her on audio.
Good evening, Mr. Tharoor. Thank you for such a delightful session.
Hi, Ridhima. Good to see you.
Hi. So my question is actually on a lighter note. If you had to pick a word from Tharoorasaurus to describe yourself as a politician or as an author, what would that word be? I know it's a tough question.
Well, I don't know if I can pick a word off the list of contents of Tharoorasaurus, because I don't really, I'm not guilty of hyperbole too often. I'm not a goon. I don't indulge in epicaricacy. I'm not a yogi. So those words may not apply. Jokingly, I might say that a word that applies to me is incorrigible. But even that's not really true, because I am quite willing to be corrected. I'm one of those people who's very open-minded. If I say or do something wrong and somebody points it out, I'm willing to say you're right. So I'm not even incorrigible, really. Irrepressible, perhaps, is the best word for me, because various people have tried to repress me over the years, and so far no one has entirely succeeded. Not even so far our government.
Wow, that's nice. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Idma.
Next, we have Archana Dalmia here. Archana ji, you can ask your question, please.
Hi, Shashi.
Hello, Archana. How are you? Good to see you.
Good. I wanted to ask you that you're an established genius with both your words and your wit. But often this very talent gets you into trouble.
Go on.
So what do you have to say about that?
Look, I mean, and specifically in the context of this book, this business about when I might have used a word wrong that gets one into trouble. You're quite right. As somebody who understands the world of politics, Archana, you know that one has to learn very early on the importance of choosing your words very carefully, and especially if it's being said in the public domain. I don't think I've really used words in the wrong context, but statements I've made have frequently been either taken out of context or deliberately misinterpreted. So the entire cattle class episode that some of you may remember from now 10 years ago, 11 years ago, sort of illustrates this. Here was a phrase that was commonly used, particularly in the West, to critically describe the rather inhumane way in which airlines pack in as many people as possible in economy class. And so the airlines are the ones being targeted by the phrase cattle class, because they're boosting their bottom lines by squeezing our bottoms into economy class like cattle. That was the idea. So when a journalist asked me, Mr. Minister, during the government's austerity drive, Mr. Minister, will you travel cattle class? And I innocently replied, yes, in cattle class, out of solidarity with all our holy cows. My gosh, you can imagine the way the dung hit the fan. And it was instantly being twisted as either being elitist or anti-cow, or in some cases, both. And the fact is that wasn't the intention, but particularly once it got translated into Gujarati and Hindi and Malayalam and so on, obviously I became an object of hatred. This kind of snooty elitist who was calling economy class passengers cattle, which was not what I had done, but that was the impression. And it made me realize that in a multilingual polity like ours, it almost doesn't matter what you intend to convey and what you say. All that matters is what people think they've heard. Shakespeare famously said this: the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. And that's something which I had to learn the hard way, that you can say what is defensively the right thing, and you can still be completely misinterpreted and twisted. So after a couple of such episodes, I've been much more careful. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not still subject to these things, but at least in most cases now I'm only subject to attack for deliberate malicious political purposes, and not because I inadvertently used a word that was liable to misinterpretation. Now, I'm much more careful about inadvertently using words, but saying things that can be twisted. It happened as recently as yesterday. I had actually said something in a literary thing, not a think fest as they call it in Lahore, but done virtually by Zoom, which was completely consistent with what I was saying within India. I had actually made a 20-minute speech in Parliament about COVID mismanagement, and the BJP had nothing to say because they couldn't refute anything I'd said. But the moment that I said this in the Lahore Think Fest, and that too only in 2 minutes, out of a 1-hour discussion on the post-COVID world, I said 2 minutes on the situation in India, and the BJP went to town attacking me for it. So that kind of thing you can't do. That's part of the game of politics. And it doesn't matter what you say. I mean, in that particular instance, you know that the attack is not really linked to the merits of what you've said. So you're right. I still get into trouble once in a while, but less and less do I get into it by accident. I tend to get into trouble only because people really want to put me in trouble.
So now you think before you say.
I think always before I say, but now I think more about what other people might think before I say.
Great. Thank you, Shashi.
Thanks, Archana.
Next up, we have Nilima Adhar.
Hi.
Hi, Nilima. How are you?
Hi, Shashi. Looks like the sisters are taking you by storm today.
Absolutely. And an author in this case to boot. So go ahead.
Thank you. I want to take you away from this terse and boring politics topic, and I want to get you on to sparkle and light up the screen, as I would say. Shashi, I remember some years ago you narrating a joke in fluent French, and I was absolutely flabbergasted. So not only are you fluent with English and you're an absolute wizard with the words, but your mastery of French is another story. So what I want to ask you is, will you tell us a fun joke today, because this is a closed door session of only the Prabha Khaitan women, and no question of anything leaking out to Twitter and you getting...
Sorry, Nilima, no, it's going to be broadcast afterwards. So I'll have to be very much on my best behavior.
Yeah, but
and French jokes by definition are naughty ones. I certainly can't do that. What I'm willing to do for you is to tell you why I won't tell pandemic jokes, because, you know, after I did that sort of stand-up comedy act, you may remember, on Amazon last year, people kept expecting me to come up with these one-liners, and during the this time when the lockdown was happening, people had a lot of time on their hands, and I got a lot of requests for more stand-up comedy. I said, no, I'm not even going to give you sit-down comedy, because, you know, this is not the right time for this kind of humor. But then I tried a few lame ones, and I don't mind sharing those with you. You know, I said, due to the lockdown and the quarantine, I can only tell you inside jokes. See, that didn't work very well. Then I explained to someone, the full name of COVID-19 is actually N-COVID-19. The N stands for the novel coronavirus epidemic of 2019. So someone asked, why do they call it a novel coronavirus? I said, well, because it's a long story. Okay, at least that got a laugh out of me. And then I also said, you know, at the same time, this is the longest anything made in China has ever lasted. that didn't go on so well. So
But
and then, of course, frankly, our people had to suffer so many real problems that I feel bad cracking jokes like, I sneezed in front of my laptop and it started an antivirus scan on its own. That kind of thing. But I probably will end by saying that, so many people have the virus without realizing they're infected because the symptoms sometimes show up 14 days later. If I tell you a coronavirus joke right now, you may have to wait 2 weeks to see if you'll get it.
Brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
You
you,
changed the
Nirima.
mood all right.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Next up, we have Ms. Shalu Goel. Ms. Goel, requesting you to unmute, please.
While you're doing that, Manisha, I happen to open the chat box and there's a question from a Mohini Karkare. I think she's probably not done it the other way. She's done it in the chat box. If you want, we can end with that as well.
So since we've lost Ms. Goel, we can actually take up that question. It says, just one question, sir. Why politics?
Okay, well, the answer is very simple, that in a democracy, I think the best way that you can make a difference in human beings' lives is through politics. I really don't believe in politics for politics' sake. That's why you'll see me very rarely in the kind of dramabazi gesture politics that seems to be the basic requirement of most politicians. I'm more interested in policies, in lawmaking, in trying to influence the direction of our government, and in trying to transform the lives of people through the political process, because that's ultimately what a democracy makes possible. A democracy makes possible for each of us to be able to contribute our best knowledge, our best ideas, our best convictions, principles, values into shaping and designing the kind of future we want our children to have in our country. And therefore, if you were in a dictatorship or a monarchy or whatever, the option doesn't exist. If you were in China, you have to be a member of the Communist Party and climb up the greasy pole the long way. But in India, as in a democracy, every individual has a right to play a role in determining their country's political destiny. And that's why I thought politics was worth doing. I could always write and speak. Those are the two things that I was doing anyway before coming into politics. But I felt, and I believe rightly,
wonderful,
I would reach a much larger audience through politics, and what is more, have more of an opportunity to make a decisive difference through politics than merely through writing. Through writing, I will reach your minds, but through politics, I might actually be able to impact your laws and the government's policies.
Great. We now have Ms. Shalini Mundara. Shalini ji, could you please unmute yourself?
Hi, sir. Good evening.
Hi, good evening.
It was a pleasure listening to you. My question is, why nationalism?
Well, because our government has made it an issue again. You know, we all grew up taking nationalism for granted, right? And certain ideas linked to nationalism. And to be honest, that was a nationalism that didn't threaten anybody. It was nationalism, yes, against the British colonial rule. But once we'd won our freedom, it was a nationalism that was inclusive and integrative. Whereas what we're seeing in the last 6 years is a very different notion of nationalism, where nationalism is identified with one religion and speakers of one language and people from one region of the country, where dissent and disagreement is increasingly termed as anti-national, where people who challenge the government are told to go to Pakistan. I mean, all of this is, to my mind, raising a fundamental question of, if I am anti-national and I'm somebody who has been since birth entitled to a British passport and I've never exercised that because I believe in nationalism and I believe in my Indian identity and I care about mattering to India, as I once said in an interview. India matters to me and I want to matter to India. Now, if I am anti-national, then what exactly is this nationalism against which I'm found wanting? So I wanted to explore it intellectually for myself, but also for the very many others who perhaps take a term like nationalism uncritically and don't understand how it's being abused and misused and transformed in the course of this present government's work.
So what are your expectations? Will be a different definition of nationalism, which you are trying to teach people and take it in that way, the way in your perspective?
let's read the book. It isn't out yet. I mean, you can pre-order, but it's not in your hands till November. And let's talk about it again. I'll volunteer to Prabha Khaitan Foundation to come back to you, thoughtful ladies, and respond to your questions about this when you've actually had a chance to see what I've said. But that's fairer than us having a discussion on the basis of a very short summary of a fairly substantial book.
Thank you.
Great. I think we've run out of time, Preeti, and
can I just go back to Can I just go back to one of the words again?
Okay. To end with, last question.
To end with, because I think this is the right kind of nationalistic word to go back to. Okay. Satyagraha. Would you like to talk about that?
Which one's a satyagraha?
Does it have any relevance today?
I know it surprised some people to find this in a book of English words, but my reasoning is very simple. People don't realize that actually Gandhiji came up with the word satyagraha in South Africa. And he came up with it in an English newspaper where he ran a contest for people to find a better word than the word that English or British journalists were using to describe his civil disobedience campaign in South Africa. They were calling it passive resistance. And he said, listen, if you're prepared to fight for your beliefs, it can't be passive. It's something much more than that. So he invited people to come up with a one-word term and a better term. And satyagraha was the result of this process. And coming from two Sanskrit roots, satya being truth and graha, to hold on to something, holding on to truth was what Gandhiji felt his activists were engaged in doing. And I thought that was a lovely story. So I told that story and talked about what Gandhiji understood by truth and by satyagraha in the little essay in Tharoor. So I think that there are only two directly Indian words in the book, if you don't count words like goon that I still think came from India. I didn't use loot, but loot's another word that they openly stole from.
And the one that you said you made up, and then it turned out you didn't make it up.
I didn't make it up, prepone. But the other word I use is namaste, which has become so popular now thanks to coronavirus, when even the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, is going around doing this when he greets other world leaders and is telling people that he learned that from India. So again, it's explaining what the origin of namaste is and what we're trying to convey. It's actually the sort of divine in us saluting the divine in someone else. That's the meaning of the gesture. But anyway, I will leave you by saying that I found this a fascinating interaction. It's lovely to meet so many very, very thoughtful readers who are also asking stimulating and intelligent questions, which is why I'll be very happy to be back for my next book. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Prabha Khaitan Foundation and the Ehsas women and everybody who's here today listening to you, I think it's been a wonderful, engaging conversation, and we've learned lots of new words and their meanings and your political ideology beside. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All the best to all of you. Take care.
Thank
See you again.
Thank you.
Bye.